Thank you for joining me here today. I'm here with on the Ottawa Summit for this session, Security 202, A Journey to Protect Your Workloads on AWS. If we haven't met, my name is James Kiersted, and I'm a solutions architect based here in Ottawa. And I've been with AWS for about 4.5 years, and in that time, I've been working with the federal government of Canada. So public sector customers, they work very hard to put security framework controls in place to make sure that the services that they deliver to Canadians are safe and securely architected. Customers can take months to put these security controls in place, prepare an evidence package, and navigate the security, what's called the Security Assessment and Authorization process, or SANA. This session, I'll share how AWS is investing in to help customers put their applications into production with an authority to operate, or ATO. So let's get started. We'll start by reviewing what the Security Assessment and Authorization process is. Like I said, the SANA. When you're trying to put applications into production while meeting the controls in a security framework, like the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity's, or CCCS's Cloud Medium Profile, what used to be called the PBMM. We'll talk about the resources available to you when you're documenting the security of the cloud. That is, AWS is part of the shared responsibility model. We'll talk about the AWS investment in open source, which can help customers address security framework controls that lie on the customer side of the shared responsibility model. We'll talk about how to use open source accelerators when addressing common infrastructure controls, reducing the number of controls that you need to address for your application that's under development. And then lastly, I will introduce AWS Audit Manager that can help you with the automated collection of evidence that you will need to provide as an assigned security assessor as part of the SANA. While there'll be a lot of compliance work that you still need to get through during an SANA, I hope that you'll come away with an understanding of some of the AWS resources that are available to you to help you get through the process. So at AWS, security is our top priority. So if there's a problem, we drop everything. If things are not where they need to be, swarm on the problem and until we're back on track. We've built a number of services internally to keep your data safe. Some of these we have externalized, like Amazon Guard Duty, which is our intelligent threat detection, and AWS Security Hub, which is our security and compliance hub. These help you protect your data as well. We'll also provide a wide variety of best practices documentation, encryption tools, and other guidance that customers can leverage in delivering application-level security measures. AWS partners, many of whom have decades of experience working with public sector customers, offer hundreds of products that can be deployed on AWS to help customers meet their security objectives. These offerings range from network security, configuration management, access control, malware, data encryption, and so on. Typically, putting public sector applications into production requires receiving an authority to operate from an organization's chief security officer or departmental security officer. To obtain that ATO, the project team needs to implement security controls from a framework such as the aforementioned CCCS Cloud Medium. Frameworks identify the recommended security controls that should be implemented, such as encryption for data at rest. Collecting and providing that evidence is improving that you have met those controls is what you're doing during an SNA. So the project team will compile the evidence in the form of like screenshots of the configuration, command outputs, API responses, to create the control responses that are collected into what's called an evidence package. The organization will assign an internal assessor, to review those responses and is either satisfied that the control has been met or sends the project team back to address any residual issues. When the assessor is satisfied that those controls are met, they send a recommendation to the CSO or departmental security officer to either grant an ATO or an IATO, as the case may be, if there's an accepted residual risk that's being tracked in a risk register with action plans to mitigate those. So we did a survey, and what we found is that 80% have no automated processes for enabling compliance and collecting evidence on an ongoing basis for assessments. They still respond to a lot of assessments requests manually. So a lot of email traffic back and forth when you're going through this exercise. And governance, risk, and compliance teams report that more than 60% of their time is just spent collecting evidence. But we also heard loud and clear that customers, they want to be able to enhance their compliance and audit capabilities in a cloud-native way. That is, they don't want to have to go out and procure something or buy some kind of off-the-shelf product in order to get the SNA job done. But before we proceed further, let's review the shared responsibility model. So, and this should, for the most part, should not be new to people, but I'll just go over the same ground here. AWS is responsible for protecting the infrastructure that runs on this, and for protecting the infrastructure that runs all the services offered in the AWS cloud. In other words, the security of the cloud. The infrastructure is composed of the hardware, software, the networking, the facilities that run AWS cloud services. The customer responsibility will be determined by the AWS cloud services that are, the customer selects for their application that's under development. This determines the amount of configuration work that you're going to be responsible for, the security responsibilities. So for example, services such as Amazon Elastic Cloud Compute or Amazon EC2, those are categorized as infrastructure as services, infrastructure as a service, and as such require that the customer perform all the necessary security configuration and management tasks. If a customer uses EC2, they're responsible for the management of the guest operating system, including all those updates and security patches for that operating system, and any application software or utilities installed by the customer on those instances, and the configuration of the EC2 security groups. So in other words, the customer is responsible for the security in the cloud. This model also extends to the IT controls. So just as the responsibility to operate the IT environment is shared between AWS and its customers, so is the management, operation, and verification of those IT controls. AWS can help relieve customers of some of that burden by operating controls that are managed associated with the physical infrastructure that's deployed in the AWS environment that may have previously been managed by the customer in your data center. It's also possible to shift more of this burden to AWS depending on how you architect your applications, which I'll go into later. Customers can use the AWS control and compliance documentation available to them to perform their control evaluation and verification procedures as required, which brings us to AWS supporting more security standards and compliance certifications than any other offering. So they include PCI DSS, HIPAA, FedRAMP, the Controlled Goods Program here in Canada, and as I mentioned a couple times, the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity's Cloud Medium. These help satisfy the compliance requirements for virtually every regulatory agency around the globe. To aid your compliance efforts, AWS regularly achieves third-party validation of thousands of global compliance requirements that we continually monitor to help you meet security and compliance standards for finance, retail, healthcare, government, and beyond. You inherit the latest security controls operated by AWS, strengthening your own compliance and certification programs while also receiving access to tools you can use to reduce your cost and time to run your own specific security assurance requirements. We have a number of reports that attest to AWS's controls on our side of the shared responsibility model with over 20 different reports spanning global compliance regimes. You should be able to find the control that you and your assessors care about. Here I want to call out the CCCS Assessment Summary Report for the AWS Canadian region that was recently made available in the AWS Artifact Console. Anyone with an AWS account can go into the AWS Artifact service and download this report as a PDF document to review. If you need access to the detailed report, what you'll need to do is you'll have to work with your IT security organization to make that request of CCCS directly. In the AWS Canadian Region Assessment, I'm often asked by customers if some AWS service that they're considering for their application architecture has been assessed by the Canadian Cybersecurity Center. So that's actually been all documented and is now on our public website. And so we've recently made some changes to the layout. So whereas before CCCS was part of a list of different frameworks, now it has its own landing page. So you can go land on this page and you'll be able to see at a glance whether the service that you're considering has been assessed by the Cybersecurity Center when you're architecting your solution. So just to explain how that works, so CCCS will review the AWS region annually. So AWS provides all the compliance documentation for those services that are in the region on the data submission. So in between annual, because this is an annual exercise, in between annual assessments, there may be new AWS services that are launched, especially around like reInvent time, or there are services that were not necessarily in the Canadian region at the time of submission, but have been brought to the Canadian region. So in those cases, the services may not appear in the services and scope documentation. But just because those services are not listed doesn't mean you can't use it in your application architecture. A customer can choose to accept a documented risk and launch maybe with an IATO, or if they can pull together a business case, it's possible to have it assessed out of cycle. But no organization has unlimited resources, but if you can create a compelling business case that you have a project ready to go live, and there's an urgent need to put into production, usually you can make a business case to have that service assessed. If there's any questions about whether you can use an AWS service in your architecture while meeting a security framework control, don't be shy about reaching out to your AWS account team. We're here to help. So great, the AWS services that I'm using in my architecture are in scope for the CCCS region assessment, so we should be covered, right? Well, not yet. So just because the AWS has those certifications, it doesn't mean that you'll be automatically accredited as well. So applications that are built on top of AWS services are not implicitly compliant to security controls that the AWS services are compliant with. Customers need to assess those applications separately by engaging with the assessors that have been assigned for the SANA. So you can use our CCCS assessed services in the Canadian region to build your applications, but you need to ensure that you've configured appropriate encryption access rates with the assessors, reviewing them with your assessors and making sure that they understand how those are implemented, for example. So I haven't spoken about how AWS is responsible for the security of the cloud and access to assessment reports in AWS Artifact. Is there anything we can do to help implement common controls? That is, how can we raise the waterline so that we can address a lot of common controls that are across projects, and just what we're left with is the balance of controls that I need to address for my application that's under development. So diving deeper into the shared responsibility model, services such as Amazon EC2, which are your virtual machines in the cloud. AWS takes responsibility for everything from the global infrastructure up to the hypervisor. You would need to manage, like I was saying before, you would still need to manage the patching of the guest operating system and all the components that are above it. But other AWS services fall into different categories. So, we have, for our container services, for example, we have AWS Fargate, but there's also other managed services like Amazon RDS. Amazon RDS, our relational database service, where we don't expose the operating system to you. Instead, what we do is we expose the database engine to you, and we'll patch, for example, we'll patch that database within your maintenance window. We also have other services. So, we have what are called abstracted services. A really good example is Amazon S3, which is our highly durable object storage service. There's no operating system exposed to you. There's no database engine or any other platform for you to interact with, so you don't have to worry about patching or managing it. All that is on the AWS side of the shared responsibility model. So looking from left to right, infrastructure services are more customizable, but that means you're going to have more responsibility for not just the security, but the compliance aspects in your architecture. Whereas on the right, the abstracted services, they're less customizable, but there's also less responsibility for you. So the message I want to leave you with here today is to try to shift that burden to AWS by working off the right as much as possible. AWS has also given a lot of thought into how we might accelerate customers through their SNAs through security control automation. So AWS has developed an open-sourced automation solutions that can help customers implement some, but not all, of the controls that are the responsibility of the customer in that shared responsibility model. One of these open source solutions is the AWS Secure Environment Accelerator. So AWS software engineers had spent some time developing, and they open sourced it for customers to use. So this is available on GitHub. To date, we have more than 45 customers that have deployed this open source solution. So we estimate that the Secure Environment Accelerator helps meet 70% of the CCCS medium controls that have a technical element. The deployment of the security controls is driven by a configuration file that is defined by the customer. So the use of the automation solution in the field has reduced the time for implementation from what used to take months of effort down to a couple days, mostly in planning how to define that configuration file. AWS continues to invest in accelerators, and we'll be hearing more about that over the next few months, expanding the scope of the AWS services that are, as AWS services are announced or updated. But along with our accelerators, we also have developed what is called a generic evidence package that we make available to customers. So the generic evidence package was actually the result of a collaboration between our AWS professional services and the Canadian Border Services Agency, or CBSA. So AWS had helped CBSA implement cloud medium technical controls, and the design of those controls ended up actually in that aforementioned AWS Secure Environment Accelerator, so to make it repeatable and for other customers to be readily able to deploy those. CBSA had decided that they wanted to make that evidence package available to other public sector customers. So AWS sanitized that evidence package so that it can be reused. You can request the evidence package from your AWS account teams. So the package provides evidence for 91 technical controls. And upon receiving it, what you do is you update those controls with outputs, screenshots, verbiage that describes the implementation of the controls in your environment. The evidence provides examples of how assessors have been satisfied with the evidence provided, and it can help customers pull together their own evidence package faster. But you have to keep in mind that every assessment can be different. So what may have worked at CBSA may not be accepted by your assessor, who may have different interpretations or expectations. But nonetheless, the generic evidence package is a useful starting point. And thanks go out to CBSA for being willing to share this. So we have 24 customers that have so far have received that generic evidence package. So again, please reach out to your AWS account teams for more information. So one of the things that we talked about was inheritance. So using those accelerators that I talked about, we have a concept called stack assessments. So once I've deployed the accelerator and gone through an SANA and received an ATO for the infrastructure, now my application project can focus on just those controls that are specific to the architecture of the application that I'm designing, or the architecture the application takes. That is, you stack the more narrowly scoped application assessment on top of the existing infrastructure ATO to more rapidly get your application ATO. Okay, so I'm stacking my assessments. How can I more efficiently collect the evidence the evidence for those controls in order to get through my application SANA? Well, To recap, typically when a project is initiated, dev teams will start to undertake development, and at some point a security assessor will be assigned to start reviewing evidence. The earlier you can get the assessor assigned, the better, because one of the things that I have found in the field is that it's important to understand what those goalposts are, so you can address those with the assessor while you still have all your project resources assigned to your project. So the assessor will present something like a workbook of controls from the CCCS medium profile, perhaps with some scoping. The goalposts are defined, and now the evidence has to be gathered that all those controls have been met to the satisfaction of the assessor. In many cases, you may be able to inherit controls. Those controls could be inherited from the CCCS region assessment that I mentioned, or perhaps controls that have been implemented by something like the Secure Environment Accelerator, which itself may have gone through an SANA and achieved an ATL. So now you're left with figuring out how to collect the evidence required. So I have seen some work in public sector to automate some of that evidence collection using scripting, but it's still largely a manual exercise. So customers have asked us, is there a cloud-native way of collecting all this, so they don't have to go out and buy something, or I don't have to develop something in order to get an understanding of the state of the environments that are deployed out there and their compliance. And this is where AWS Audit Manager comes in. So AWS Audit Manager, what it does, it helps you continuously evaluate your AWS usage in order to simplify how you assess risk and compliance with various regulations and industry standards. It saves you time by automatically collecting that evidence, and it organizes it in such a way that it's easy for you to analyze per the control requirement. And it also assists in gathering and preparing evidence for assessments. AWS Audit Manager, retains the collected evidence in its immutable evidence store for a period of 2 years. It's also possible to have Audit Manager generate assessments which contain, the assessments will it'll be a zip file that will contain a summary document in PDF, evidence folders with evidence for each of the resources that were evaluated, and a digest, so a checksum for all the contents that are in that zip file, and that can be also exported and stored in S3. So the integration of AWS Audit Manager with AWS organizations, what that means is you're able to run Audit Manager over multiple accounts and consolidate all the evidence into a single delegated administrator for your entire organization. So the benefit of that is that you don't have to jump from account to collect your evidence and understand what the state of the compliance of that account is. You have a single location you can go to see the state for the entire organization. So let's look at a couple of the benefits of AWS Audit Manager. So AWS Audit Manager provides you with an easy way to map your AWS usage to your controls. You can use a pre-built compliance framework, or you can build your own custom frameworks and have Audit Manager start to collect evidence for those. Automated collection allows customers to focus on reviewing the relevant evidence and fixing the problems instead of focusing on the exercise of collecting that evidence in the first place. So you always have the reports ready to go whenever you need it. That's really important because Audit Manager makes you ready for the assessments in a continuous manner. And the assessment data is securely stored and remains unaltered. This makes it a lot easier and efficient to respond if there's changes in your application architecture or in the sensitivity that triggers a reassessment. Yeah. So I'm going to have slides that are going to cover that here in a couple of minutes. So AWS Audit Manager includes pre-built assessment frameworks from AWS and its partners. Some of the frameworks include CIS, PCI DSS, and recently we worked with the Canadian Cybersecurity Center to add the Cloud Medium framework. You also have the option, like I mentioned, to create your own custom framework, and they can have custom controls as well. So for example, and this came up recently, so you can have the CCCS medium framework, but keep only those controls that are required for your 12 guardrails that you have to have in place on your AWS accounts that are required within 30 days when you receive your account under the Government of Canada's Cloud Services Framework when you order your account from shared services. So how does Audit Manager work? Well, you can leverage the existing frameworks, or you can create an assessment based on your requirements. You also have the option of customizing the services and accounts that you want to include in the scope of the assessment. Once you've created the assessment, Audit Manager begins to continuously collect the evidence from the date from when you've created that assessment. So you can review and generate a report with all the evidence necessary whenever necessary. The advantage it provides is it's an easy way to track the chain of custody of evidence with access controls, and enables collaboration to help maintain the evidence security and integrity. Now, how does AWS Audit Manager produce the evidence? Well, it considers data from multiple sources, such as AWS Config, AWS Security Hub, AWS CloudTrail, AWS Services API calls, etc. But Audit Manager continuously monitors that data and combines it to produce its evidences. So if we take PCI DSS, for example, you want to show the assessor that you have, you're compliant with the encryption policies, such as for elastic block storage or EBS volumes. So in detail, what happens is, to generate that evidence, AWS Audit Manager will scan the AWS CloudTrail for EBS API calls. What it's looking for is enable or disable EBS default encryption. That API, where it checks for the default encryption for EBS volumes, whether it's been enabled or not. It also checks if there's an AWS config rule for this particular check. Then it marks the account as being compliant or not. So it compiles all these evidences together and maps the evidence to its control and displays it in the Audit Manager console. This makes the process a lot easier than going to check multiple sources individually. Another example would be AWS Security Hub, which monitors CIS and AWS foundational security benchmarks. There's a control that one must ensure that password policies have at least one lowercase letter. And then what it will do is it will review the state and and then produce a pass or fail finding. So when Audit Manager does it collects this as evidence for each account, and then that is under scope for the assessment. And after collecting that evidence and evaluating it, it marks it as compliant or not. So to directly answer your question, this will work with AWS services. Okay, this is the most important value proposition of Audit Manager. It's in this mapping. It's the ability to gather from AWS services. It'll gather data to your question earlier. It'll gather data from the AWS services on the left, such as CloudTrail and Config that I mentioned. It turns that data into raw evidence and maps it to a control. So in the world of regulation, you have to have a certain expertise inside that domain. And so when looking at CCCS medium, for example, it says this is the rule, we are interpreting it this way, and it's relevant to these services. And this is how we're going to try to solve it, or this is how we're going to solve it. That often requires both a mix of domain and technology experience that's hard to find. So what Audit Manager helps our customers with is that they don't have to worry about this, about writing those control mappings. In a lot of cases, that gives them an excellent starting point of how they're going to meet these controls. All of that is gathered, and then it's included in the assessment report, and you can take that and hand it over to your assessor. So you can use AWS Audit Manager framework, the Audit Manager framework for the CCCS Cloud Medium, to help you prepare for assessments. You will find this framework under the Standard Frameworks tab of the Framework Library in AWS Audit Manager. This framework includes a pre-built collection of controls with descriptions and testing procedures. So this was a result of collaboration between CCCS and AWS. These controls are grouped into control sets and according to CCCS requirements. So you can have, you can also customize this framework and its controls to support internal assessments if you have very specific requirements. Using the framework as a starting point, you can create an AWS Audit Manager assessment and start collecting evidence for the CCCS medium cloud. So in your assessment, you can specify the AWS accounts that are in scope and the services that you want to include in your assessment. After you create that assessment, what happens is that Audit Manager will start to assess your AWS resources. It does this based on the controls that are identified in the CCCS medium cloud control profile framework. When it's time for an assessment, you or a delegate, because you can delegate the review of these, you will review the collected evidence, and then you add it to the assessment report. And then you can use the assessment report to show that your controls are working as intended. So now what I'm going to do is I'll show a quick recorded demo of selecting and using the CCCS medium framework to perform an assessment.
I'm going to demonstrate configuring and using AWS Audit Manager to generate an assessment report. First, we'll open the AWS Organizations console in the Organization Management account. Management of Audit Manager in an AWS organization can be delegated to a member account of that organization. Once I've delegated administration of Audit Manager to that account, all the evidence, controls, status, and the assessment reports will be centralized in that account. You will not have to jump around from account to account to review evidence. This organization structure here was rolled out for me when I used the AWS Secure Environment Accelerator, which we see a lot of Government of Canada departments using to roll out some of the technical controls in the CCCS medium framework. But looking at this org, I'm going to choose to delegate Audit Manager administration to my security account. So I'll make note of this AWS account ID here. Now I'm going to switch to the AWS Audit Manager console. In the same management account. I'm going to go into Setup, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to the Delegated Administrator section, and I'm going to paste in the account ID that I copied. I'm going to click on Delegate, and then I'm going to go to the bottom and complete my setup. The rest of the Audit Manager setup will be in that security account that I've delegated to. So let's switch over to that account. Now that I've opened up the AWS Audit Manager, I see I have like the delegated admin view. So let's go in and customize our settings. By default, Audit Manager will encrypt your data using the Audit Manager service key that it creates and manages. It's also possible for customers to create and use their own KMS keys. You can also select the IAM roles that you want to have access to your Audit Manager data. Or you can even create a role that's scoped for the person that's undertaking assessments in your organization. The Audit Manager service will store your data for 2 years. It'll have a 2-year retention in its immutable evidence store. But you do have the option to specify an S3 bucket to store your audit data. And of course, and this is in addition to the immutable evidence store. Once you've created, you specified the destination bucket, you can set whatever retention and security policies you want on that bucket. You have the option to specify an AWS simple notification service topic if you like to receive notifications for report events. Notifications can be in the form of SMS text, emails, or webhooks to, say, a Slack instance or Teams channel. You can optionally set up AWS Config and AWS Security Hub to create evidence from config rules and Security Hub findings. In my case, because I've used the AWS Secure Environment Accelerator, these services have already been set up in my organization. We can now save our audit manager settings. I'm going to review the configuration, click Save. Let's navigate to the framework library. We will search for the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity's Medium framework. Frameworks serve as the templates for assessments. They specify the configuration rules that must be followed for assessments to pass, as well as other settings such as how often audit manager assessment updates will be performed. For our assessment, having selected the CCCS medium profile as a starting point, we note that this consists of 165 control sets, 602 controls, 206 of which are fully automated controls, whereas 396 you will have to upload some kind of manual evidence for that control. But we'll talk about that here shortly. AWS Audit Manager will be sourcing its automated evidence from multiple sources, including Amazon Elastic Cloud Compute, or EC2, AWS CloudTrail, AWS Identity and Access Management, or IAM, AWS Config, Amazon CloudWatch, Amazon Key Management Service, or KMS, and AWS License Manager, along with other service APIs. So let's create an assessment. But one thing before we move on to that, I want to point out is it's also possible, like if you're just curious to understand like these mappings, you can actually go into the framework and you can explore the control sets and the controls. And one of the things that you'll be able to see here is it'll identify how a technical control has been met on AWS. So I go into access enforcement. You can see in this case how given the mappings, how we would address that control is to use AWS config rules, and these are the rules that we would put into effect, and that would allow us to have a response to that control. So let's create an assessment. We'll give it a name and a description. We'll also specify a destination S3 bucket for storing our AWS Audit Manager data. This is in addition to the service internal storage, the immutable storage that I referred to earlier. We'll specify which accounts we want to be in scope for the audit manager. In this case, I'll select the entire organization. Since this assessment is created from a framework, Audit Manager automatically maps and selects the data sources and services in scope. We will select appropriate roles in the account as audit owners. You can, of course, create your own custom role for people in that assessment with the assessment responsibility in your organization. will review our configuration and then create the assessment. Auto Manager will automatically start to collect evidence. It could take a day or so because of the number of control sets in the CCCS medium framework and the number of AWS accounts that are in scope. This is especially so if there's many AWS resources that are being used by multiple applications in your AWS organization. I'll pause the video so that we can skip ahead to when the process is complete. So I've now had Auto Manager running a couple days. You can see the control sets as well as their status, their delegation, the total evidence that has been collected so far, and the evidence that has been added to the assessment report. Delegation allows you to assign a control set to someone to review, such as a domain expert. Let's look at the details of one of the controls. I'm going to look at dive into the control set, identification and authentication. When I could expand the control set, I could see the individual controls and their status. Some of these I've reviewed and some of which I have not. I'm going to take a look at identification and authentication, or IA2A. The way this control is described, the information system uniquely identifies and authenticates organizational users or processes acting on behalf of organizational users. From here, you can update the control status. So in this case, I've already reviewed it. I can upload custom evidence. Now, in the case of custom evidence, I have to upload that to an S3 bucket, and then I will reference that evidence here in the S3 bucket. I can also take a look at where the data source was for the automated evidence collection. In this case, it was AWS config, and along with the mappings here as well. I can provide comments on the control and see all the historical comments. Plus, I can see the change log. We can see that the evidence folder has identified some compliance issues. Let's add the evidence folder to the assessment report and then take a closer look at the issue. The most recent evidence is non-compliant. If we open it, you can view the details about the evidence, including its attributes, the event name, and the resources that were involved. You can also view the JSON output. Note that the AWS Auto Manager APIs are available for programmatic access. Now that I've finished reviewing some of the control sets in our assessment, and I've added them to my assessment report, we can now generate that assessment report. It's going to give we're going to give the report a name and a description. And then I'm going to generate the assessment report. Reports can be generated continuously for the same or different resources on a scheduled basis. Let's download our report and take a look at its folder structure. The folder contains a PDF with the summary of the compliance of each control set, as well as subfolders containing the corresponding control set data. Let's look at the summary PDF and review the compliance of the control set and the controls we noted compliance issues with earlier. It was the IA2A identification and authentication for organizational users. If we scroll down, we can see the hyperlinks to the actual evidence files we want to take a closer look at. If I open one and scroll down, I can see that there's a config rule for my IAM password policy that isn't compliant. I can also see the AWS account ID and the region of that config rule. I'll have IT Ops investigate why the rule is showing up as non-compliant, remediate that issue, and then it should show up as compliant on the next compliance check. We will continue to work through all the control sets and the controls until they show up as compliant in our assessment report. Having all the evidence collected in Audit Manager makes it easy to revisit the assessment if there's a change in the application architecture or the sensitivity has changed. That makes it necessary to revisit the SANA exercise for that application. Here I've demoed how to collect evidence with AWS Audit Manager using the CCCS Medium framework. Thank you.
That would have been embarrassing. So you can get quickly started with the, with the Audit Manager in the AWS Management Console. Just select the pre-built framework, such as the CCCS Medium one that I was just demoing, to launch an assessment and begin to automatically collect and organize the evidence. Audit Manager offers a free tier for first-time customers, so for the first two months. And after that, the cost is $1.25 US per 1,000 Audit Manager resource assessments per account per region. So as always, we're very interested in feedback. If you take a look at AWS Audit Manager, try it out. Reach out to your AWS account teams if you have feedback for the Audit Manager service team. Just quickly point out that you can learn more about cloud security with our resources such as white papers, videos, articles, blog posts, and documentation. So I encourage you to check those out and raise any questions with your account team.